federal government decided we didn't deserve the land and they're going to take it away from them. And they did. They paid them 25 cents on the dollar, and that's the honest God truth. It was a detriment of the few for the benefit of the majority. They stole it, it's what they did. There's no question about it. Originally, I guess we were from Virginia in the 1800s, but our relatives went to California, and that was John Bone Adams. He was one of the Adams boys. As far as I knew, he was John Quincy Adams' son. Now, maybe that's right and maybe that's wrong, but this is where I came from. And he married, John Bone Adams, married Linda Terrell from Virginia, and that's legitimate. I know that because her name's on the records in Virginia. So they went to California on a wagon train in the early 1800s. They got into John Bone Adams, my great-great-grandfather, went there originally horseback and went into Oregon with a couple cousins, I was told. They trapped beaver and whatever they could for a couple winters. Came back through California. At that time, it wasn't California and it wasn't Oregon. But they had rode horseback as far as Oregon and trapped and come back through California and they had met Indians on the way up, the Pomo Indians, and got to know them through Berryessa Valley and Sacramento Valley. With the horseback, that's where they went through horseback. They came back through and they were thinking they were going through the Sacramento Valley, and they didn't. They were one range over in the hills, went through Berryessa Valley, and two brothers, the Berryessa brothers, owned that valley at that time. They had a Spanish land grant from Spain, because Spain owned California at that particular time. Anyway, they made a deal with them. They traded furs and supposedly money, said they'd come back to Virginia, sell their portion of the plantations and bring the money back. In the process, it all worked out. They ended up making the deal with the Berryessa brothers on the land. It was Jesus was one, and I don't remember the other brother, but they owned the valley at that time, and they made a deal with them on an X amount of acres, whatever it was. And they said they traded some furs. At that point in time, the Russians were there. The Indians were still, Pomo Indians were still in Berryessa Valley, some tribes of Indians. And they traded with the Indians. They had furs. They traded with the Indians and the Russians. Russians had come into Fort Ross in California, which is on the coast, and they came inland on horseback, the Russians did, to trade with the Indians, and they did. They traded, they brought beads and other things from Russia, and I don't know everything, but they traded with the Indians traded with the Russians, and John Bone Adams traded their furs and got money for it, gave it to the Berryessa brothers for property in Berryessa. Berryessa is Napa County, a portion of Napa County. In the far east side of Napa County is all Berryessa, which became Berryessa. It was not Berryessa at the time. It was Berryessa Lake now. At that time, it was part of Napa County, and it was all ranches. The Peacock Hotel was the first hotel built by a guy named Peacock, was the first man in, or at least represented, first name represented in Monticello. Wasn't Monticello at the time, it was a Peacock Hotel that was built there at the time. Later on, as homesteaders and ranchers, or people came in and bought property from the Spanish brothers, and Spanish brothers really lost all their land in horseback. They bred and raised thoroughbred horses that came from Spain originally. And they had another little piece of property in Spanish Valley, which eventually they lost all their land in gambling and racing. The two brothers did, and they had a Spanish land grant of most of Berryessa, and they lost it. And they ended up on about 150 acres that now is Spanish Flat. The county, when Lake Berryessa went in, the county took that over and made county housing out of it and made a county maintenance yard, which the road department took care of the roads around Berryessa. And it is now Napa County in there, and there's no more Berryessa brothers. John Bone Adams, they settled in Berryessa and in the north end of Berryessa. They had, I don't remember the exact amount of children they had, but they had quite a few, like 12. But my grandmother's father was one of them. Wilson Adams. Philip Adams was another, his brother. James Adams was one. I think there's close to 12 of them. I think 12 of them altogether, but I don't know all their names. But Wilson Adams married Minnie McGinnis, and Minnie McGinnis, the McGinnises, the Adams, and the Johnsons came from Virginia on a wagon train to California. The McGinnises and the Adams married, but the Johnsons there was a family of Johnsons, a husband and wife, and a couple children, but he was a Baptist, and they said he was a fire and brimstone minister, and that's what they had to live with. And he was the minister when they got all the way through the wagon train till they got to California. But in the process of on the wagon train, the Adams family got as far as Arkansas, and somewhere in Arkansas, the Indians attacked the wagon train. And in the process of that, two of the settlers, or the wagon train people, were killed. The Indians stole two of the Adams children. One little girl that was 2 years old, that's what I'm told anyway, and a boy that was about 7 to 8 years old. The boy later, after a couple of years, escaped and finally made his way to California to his family. The little girl was too young, and she wouldn't leave the Indian lady, squaw that she was raised with at that period of time. So they never saw her again, but they got their son back. And they got there, they lived in the north part of Napa, in Napa County in Berryessa. And they created a racetrack there. And with the Berryessa brothers and the Adams were supposedly loved to race horses and gamble and play, and the Spanish brothers did too. And between them all, they created a racetrack on part of the Adams property in the north part of Lake Berryessa. It's under lake right now, but it was a racetrack at one time.
Why is it under a lake now?
Well, the federal government came in 1950. Well, it started in 1946. The federal government decided they wanted it more. The people didn't deserve it. They put it that way. That's the way my grandparents would have put it. The federal government decided we didn't deserve the land, and they're going to take it away from them. And they did. They paid them 25 cents on the dollar, and that's the honest God truth. It was a detriment of the few for the benefit of the majority. They stole it, it's what they did. There's no question about it. And on top of that, there was a county line below the dam, right below the dam. The dam was placed upstream from the Napa-Solano County line, And later on, that got changed in Napa County. And Solano County moved their line up into Napa County in order to claim that it was on the dam itself. I went to high school in Winters, which was Solano County. We took a bus ride, which one of my grandfathers drove the bus, or had a bus route, taking grammar school kids and high school age to Winters to high school. Monticello had a grammar school through the 8th grade, but once he hit the 9th grade, there was a bus that one of my grandfathers had that drove the kids to Winters, which is 17 miles away, to high school and back every day. The bus would go on to Sacramento, pick up produce and whatever the one store in Monticello had. There was only one store. Any produce or whatever they wanted from Sacramento, they bought it. The bus brought it back and delivered it. So the bus got paid for hauling school kids into Winters and back, plus produce, whatever they could, and individuals if they wanted to go to Sacramento. That was it. It was pretty primitive. My mother was born in Berryessa Valley. My father was born in Berryessa Valley, or Napa County, there was no hospitals in Monticello, so they went to Napa County. Napa is a county seat. They went to Napa I'm not sure they even did that. At those years, they had babies at home. But I was born in Oakland. My dad he was born and raised, my grandfather and my dad were both raised in Napa County. In Napa, my grandfather was, and then he bought property in Berryessa Valley and raised my father there. My father went to college in Davis, California, come back out of that and went and worked at the creamery, Lucerne Creamery in Oakland. And when he married my mom went down there. They stayed there till I was born, which was only about a year and a half, and then back to Monticello and lived in Monticello the rest of the time. All of them did.
So your family's land was seized and flooded?
Yes, absolutely.
So
you can put it mildly,
wow.
And I would put it politely that way.
Sure. Wow.
Somebody has to prove respect to me anymore. I don't take it for granted that just because you work for the government, I respect you. Well, you go through that in your lifetime, it's not nice. You don't expect that. You don't think you're going to be raised in this country to go through that. How many people have to go through that? A very minute amount of people. I'll bet you didn't. Grandpappy Samuels, which was my grandfather, Henry Samuels' father, at one time they lived in Rag Canyon, which is part of Berryessa Valley. It's above the dam, but it's in a canyon, and they had a little farm there. And when my grandfather was raised, he said he never had shoes to start with. They had 12 children. They had Hazel and Henry and Earl, and I don't know the other names. They're written down in my stuff. But anyway, when he was young, as a little kid, in 1906, they had a little apple orchard out in front of the house, and it was a really old rickety house too. It wasn't much. It was a cabin, and I saw the cabin when I was a little kid. He was out there in 1906 when the earthquake hit San Francisco, the big one. He had to grab a hold of an apple tree to keep himself up, and he said he never had shoes. They were always barefoot as kids. Even when it was freezing weather, they were out there barefooted. But he was out in the orchard and had to grab an apple tree to keep himself up when the earthquake hit. And it shook that bad around, this is where Lake Berryessa is now. It was Monticello and Berryessa Valley at the time, but Berryessa Valley, they call it Berryessa Lake now, but it was still Jesus Berryessa and his brother that owned it, and it was really Berryessa Brothers, but now it's Berryessa Lake, just to clarify it. And anyway, he was born and raised in this little canyon, and then he got off, and as he grew up, he was drafted into the service. And in his growing up days, Napa was about 12 miles away over a steep hill, and his father used to harvest deer. He used to kill deer and butcher them and take deer horseback over the hill and into Napa and sell the deer to the markets there, because they legally could sell deer meat and beef at the time. And his father raised beef, but he also killed deer, and he used to have to trek over the hill 12, 13 miles on a horseback with deer and beef to sell, and that's the way they made a living. And they'd trade that for flour and whatever they needed to survive them. One story is that when my grandfather they had 3 fields out there that they would plow behind horses, and he was plowing behind a horse, and he would plow the field back and forth all day long, and it'd take 4 days to plow one little field. And he had a couple gold pieces in his pocket that his dad had given him, and that was $5 and a $10 gold piece, and he lost them in that field. And he went back there for days and days and hunted and never ever found them. His father used to go prospecting. Blue Ridge is a long range of hills, and there's a break in Blue Ridge which created the dam. They built a dam in the break in Blue Ridge, and it's a rock ledge that went from one side of a canyon to another, and that rock ledge is what they tied the dam into that built Lake Berryessa. It's 363 feet high. It's solid concrete, and that's what they tied the dam into the rock ledge. And the old man Samuels took his horse and went prospecting in this range of hills above their house, and he went a day away horseback prospecting the whole time, just looking for whatever he could find, and he found some gold. He came back, and on his way back, he was in his 60s, on his way back, he found the gold. Before he got to his house, the horse had slipped and fell on him and hurt him pretty bad. He ended up being able to get himself back up, and they got back to the house, and they took him over the hill to Napa, which is a major town, the only town in Napa County. And he ended up passing away. And they went back forever looking for that gold, where he'd found that gold, and never ever could find it. There was one little stream that I would go pan, and I had flakes of gold that I got out of that one stream. It was fun to go there, and there was a lot of artifacts and little artifacts, and there was fossils. All the rocks around there had fossils in them, and clams and little kind of shells of some kind. Anyway, that's where we found the gold. Well, I got a general engineering contractor's license, an A license, early on in 1973. I got that. Then I ended up with a gravel plant that I'd bought. We had a concrete plant, a gravel plant. Throughout that, there was a outfit come in from Africa that had been gold mining in Africa called Homestake. They came into that valley, and they went past the gravel plant and purchased a quicksilver mine that was there since the 1800s that they created, got mercury out of. They used to bring Chinese into the area from China. And this is back in the horse and buggy days. And they couldn't keep enough Chinese there, because in order to create the mercury out of cinnabar, it was a cinnabar mine. It's above Napa, it's in Napa County, but above Napa County, and it was all tunnels that they created, that they mined this cinnabar out of, and they used Chinese to retort this, and it was like brick ovens that they would fire it. So they had to constantly cut trees and make wood for the fires, and they had the Chinese tend to brick ovens to melt this cinnabar into mercury, which became your thermometers and whatever. Well, in the process of that, the Chinese only lasted about 5 to 6 weeks. Their hair would start falling out, their teeth would fall out, and they would die. They never lasted over 6, 7 months, and they were dead. So they had a constant supply of Chinamen they were importing in there and bringing to this mine. And this went on for 100 years. They wanted to discover how much gold they had, so they hired me, and we went up there with our D8s and dozers and cut drill pads. And every 300 foot throughout this area, not just me, they hired other people too, they put a drill rig and they drilled it to a 700-foot elevation, whatever they called it. They went down 700 feet to that elevation and assayed all this land, and it was a half an ounce of gold per ton of material. So they created an open pit mine. So I ran for 1 full year, 24 hours a day with our equipment up there. And we had tractors clearing the land, and they had a lake they created with the tailings. They created a mill site. They hauled that, it was an open pit mine, they hauled it with big, huge 60-yard trucks to this mill site about 2 miles away and process it in tanks, huge 3 million gallon tanks. They grind it to a talcum powder consistency and add water to it and cyanide. They really put cyanide in it. There was another area that we created, another lake, that they dumped this, they made a slurry out of it with water and the cyanide and the tailings, which they mixed all together, and the cyanide leached the gold out of it. They retrieved the gold, and I don't know that process. I saw it, but I don't know how they did it. All the tailings from that was a slurry, and that got dumped into this lake that we built. Homestake ran this gold mine for 20 years up there in Napa County, and it's actually a little bit of it in Lake County and maybe a trace of it in Solano County. They ran it for a year, 20 years, and then they closed it up. They went down 720 foot in this entire area, took all that material out and processed it and created all that gold for 20 years. They melted that, smelted it into 500-pound bars, gold bars, so nobody could steal it. They didn't leave it in small bars. This was something, and that was what I was told, that nobody's going to take this. It's 500 pounds. And I've seen them. I saw them. I had a crew working there for 3 years. We ran 24 hours a day. After that, we kind of lost our job. Well, it was in the 1946 or 47, I think. My grandfather, Henry Samuels, he decided he wanted to make some beer. And somewhere he got a recipe. He was in Napa, and some guy down there gave him some recipe for some beer and told him how to brew it. So he got a couple of what he thought were kegs. It was crocks, which was a clay jug, not a wood jug, but a clay jug. And he brewed his beer in it and made it, and he ended up purchasing like quart bottles, but they had to use corks, and he couldn't find corks, and he whittled some wood plugs to plug it. So he made this beer, and he processed the beer and put it in the jugs and put a cork in it, and he didn't have any place to store it where it was cool, and so he put it up in his attic, and they had 2 bedrooms up in the attic, and there was part of it was open attic, and two bedrooms had a floor in them, so he put it up there in boxes, and one night he said about 2 o'clock in the morning, and he heard this pop, 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 and he said pretty soon the dad burned. Stuff started leaking through the ceiling and dripping on their bed and all over the place, and all of his beer blew up on him. It was fermenting in the bottle still. So he decided he wasn't going to make any more beer. Well, Granddad got paid, but he bought Barbara and Bill 840 acres in Childs Valley. He bought 17 acres at the intersection of Silverado Trail and Con Dam in Napa Valley, which had vineyard on 3 sides of the road, and a house and stone cellar and whatever. And he bought my mom, Florence Matheson at the time. It was Florence Samuels originally, or his daughter. He bought them 62 acres. My mother, she wasn't really a nice person, but she ended up selling her share to it was 62 acres, and she sold half of it to Harry Seas Candy. And Harry Seas, Mrs. Disney, Walt Disney's wife and daughter, came out and decided they wanted some property. They bought the 25 acres that Harry C's wife had from them. And then one morning I was at my mom's house, and I was in my mid-20s, and we were sitting there having breakfast on a Sunday morning, and Mrs. Disney and her butler drives up, and we lived on a knoll in the middle of Napa Valley, and the butler drives up with a limousine in there next to the house on top, and there was a tank house, and they had to drive between it and the house, and butler drives up, and he comes up and knocks on the door, and I go to answer the door, and he says, Mrs. Disney would like to have an audience with your family, person in charge. I said, well, that'd be my mother. So I got my mother, and she walked out. The butler brought Mrs. Disney to the door, and my mom invited her in, so she come in, and Mrs. Disney says, I would like to buy your property. After she had bought Harry C's property. And my mom said, I wouldn't sell it for $1 million. And she was serious. And Mrs. Disney didn't hesitate. She says, you got your $1 million. And my mom didn't make her decision right then, but a couple of weeks later she did. And she sold it to Mrs. Disney. So Mrs. Disney ended up owning the 62 acres eventually. I got my license in 1973, my contractor's license. I took the test and got it legitimate, a Class A license in 73. I added to it a hazardous waste license and a couple other, whatever it came up. We had a confined space. We had to have other things that had to be added even to an A license. But I had it all. I bought a gravel plant, so I had a concrete plant, a gravel plant. So we're making concrete, delivering that. We were processing, blasting a quarry, pushing rock down with a D8, D6, D8. My son I had him on the back of my D6C. It had a seat tank on it behind your seat that you're operating it on, and he was 7, 8 years old, and had him wrapped up there, and he'd get up behind me on the tank. It was warm because the fuel would get hot and it'd recirculate, so he could sleep on the back of it, or half-ass sleep, excuse my language, but so he's on the back of me, and we're pushing off this hill that we're blasted, and I was pushing it off to this crusher that we had down below, and I pushed up a big pile one day, and he was back there, and I dove off, and I didn't tell him about it. And it's pretty steep. And when I dove off there, his eyes got bigger than horse manure. But anyway, it scared the living daylights out of me.
I was 4, not 7.
He learned to operate most every piece of equipment. I had 2 930 loaders, 950 loaders, which aren't huge, but they're big. They've got 3-yard buckets on them. He was 8, 9 years old. I had him loading trucks, and he was good at it. I'd put him on a loader. Somebody'd come in for the gravel plant we had an office there, and somebody'd come in for a load of rock, and I'd tell him, go load him. And he's 8, 9 years old, but he could operate the loader just as good as I could. And this loader'd come up, and the eyes are below the steering wheel in it, and the truck drivers that he's loading, their eyes would get as big as saucers. But anyway, it never hurt anybody. And I had an office in Napa. I had a we had the gravel plant, but I was a contractor, and I formed a corporation, and it was called ACT Corporation. I was down there at a main office on 1st Street in Napa, California. And anyway, we were down there at that office, and I told the young boy, I'd hired him right out of high school. He was 17, 18, and he'd worked for me like 6 years, 7 years, something like that. And we drilled and blasted. So we'd blast with dynamite this rock hill, and then we'd push it off and crush it with the crushers and bring it down to rock that the state and counties would use on roads. And we'd wash it and make concrete rock out of it also. So this boy, he called me and he said, I've drilled it and we're ready to blast. I've loaded the hill, we're ready to blast. I said, do not overload the holes, because you've got to keep the dynamite down, and I used to keep it down like 7 foot below the surface and then pack it with dirt on top of it, so that when you drill it, if you get it too far to the surface, the dynamite will throw rocks every place. And we held it down to 7 foot, and it would not throw it. I said, make sure you do not overload those holes. So he said, yeah. Well, he overloaded them. And my uncle was the undersheriff of Napa County at the time, Larry Gardner, and so I was in my office in Napa, and I got a call from the county sheriff's office, and he says, Gardner, get your goddamn, excuse my language, ass up to your gravel plant. You got rock all over the county road. I said, oh man. So I took Lauren, and we jumped in the car, and we're 25 miles away, so it took us a while to get there. We got up there, and I put him on one of the loaders, and I said, I'll go down the creek. The other loader was at the base plant where the dynamite had gone off. So I'll go get that one. So I drove down the creek, because you couldn't get down the road, but the creek bed was low on, there was no water in it hardly, and so I could go down there on a 4-wheel drive and so I went down there, and I told Lauren to get on the loader and start on this end and start cleaning the rock off the road, and I'll go to the other end and come back. Well, there was a sheriff on each end blocking traffic with their cars, and he gets to the sheriff, and the sheriff says, where the hell do you think you're going? This little kid sitting on this loader, he says, I'm gonna clear the road off, get out of the way. He did. And he got out of the way and let him go. And I got on the other end. So we got it all cleared off. It took a couple hours to do it, but it was a mess. When I graduated high school, Robert Mondavi and his brother got in a big feud. They owned Krug Winery. His family did before them, and they inherited it. When they got in a fight, Robert Mondavi got mad and left, and his brother bought him out. Robert bought a piece of property south of Krug, where the Robert Mondavi's property is now in Napa Valley. and decided he's going to build a winery. I just, in the process of graduating, and did graduate high school in St. Helena at that time. And I got the chance to get little pieces. Well, I went and got my contractor's license as soon as I got out of high school, and I did get a chance to build some of his concrete forms and whatever for his tank pads and a few things on the winery. And later on in life, after they got the winery established, Tim Mondavi and Robert, I don't know which one, but one of them hired my wife, which wasn't my wife at the time. But anyway, that's where I met my wife, that she was Tim Mondavi's secretary. And we built part of their winery, and then Robert got involved with Rothschilds, and Rothschilds and Robert together bought property directly across the Silverado Trail, it's Highway 29 from Robert Mondavi Winery. And I think it was almost 80 acres. And then I got the job from the Rothschilds to build a 20-acre-foot pond for them that got filled out of the Napa River, which was quite a project. It was a big project. And then we built the bottom section of their winery as far as the excavation part of it. And part of it's below ground level, part of it's above. But we did the excavation for the bottom part of it, plus the pond, plus some of the clearing and whatever for the vineyard. Other thing, at 23 feet deep in digging the pond for the Rothschild pond, I found an Indian bowl, 23 feet down. This was away from the Napa River. It was a legitimate Indian bowl that was ground out by some Indian eons ago. That river had wandered all over Napa Valley. It had to be back in the caveman days. It was.
Did you get to keep it?
Yeah, I kept it. My son can probably put a bigger bow than I can, because he called me and said, "Dad, we got a chance to get this winery back here." And he came back here on a vacation in Abington on Alvarado Road. There's a little one-horse winery back here, if you want to call it that, but that's about what it is.
Hey.
No, it's a beautiful winery. I mean, in California, I got paid very good money for trying to develop creeks, amphitheaters at wineries, creeks, anything to draw the public off the Silverado Trail or the Highway 29 to go to their wineries, because there's over 3,000 wineries in those valleys now, that there was only 300 when I was a kid. So the wineries out there need to draw the public to them. So they were creating all kinds of, I don't know terminology, but entities to draw people to them. You don't have to do that here. It's all here. The creek for the kids. I mean, the dogs can come here. This is a dog-friendly winery. People with their kids can come, and the kids can play. They can play in the creek. You got the lake right here. Houseboats come up. It's the end of the lake. You can have 20 houseboats sitting out here tied up in the summertime. It's just, you can't make anything so beautiful as this winery. You can't. I don't care. There's not enough money around to create a lake and do all this stuff. Well, I came back 3 years ago, but Lauren, my son, was here like 5 years ago. He came back here on vacation and drove by here and saw it. Out there we started, well, I was real young. We started terracing hillsides for planting of vineyards and developing vineyards. And we would terrace huge tracts of land and huge hillsides into 8-foot wide rows, fairly level, going around the hillside with dozers. And we'd do 500-600 acres of hillside terracing just for the rancher to plant grapevines in it that 8-foot centers on them. And they'd put wires on them and put sprinklers in them. They'd put irrigation underground prior to planting the vineyard. And that's when I was in high school. St. Helena High School was 2-story rock building, hewed rock. They were hewed out of, this is chipped out of sandstone rock. At that time, they had laborers doing it. And they were 200-pound rocks they chipped out, and that's what the high school was built out of, 2 stories high, and mortared together. And sitting on the 2nd floor of the high school in a classroom, in the 12th grade, I'd look out the window and there would be smudge pots going, which they used diesel to burn the smudge pots to keep the grapes warm, to keep them from freezing in the springtime. If they froze, you lost the crop for the whole year. And St. Helena and Napa Valley fought that forever on the vineyards. In 1956, the University of Davis, California, found out somehow in their testing, found out that water, they could sprinkle the vineyards from the time prior to the freezing till the sun would melt it. If they would keep that water going, they would save the blooms on the grapevines and they would not lose any berries. From that point on, they had frost protection. Prior to that, St. Helena and Napa Valley ran smudge pots on every 3rd row of the vineyards. They had a diesel 8-inch fire going out of a metal tube that heated the area to keep it from freezing, which they burnt thousands and thousands of gallons of diesel. We'd sit on the 2nd story of that St. Helena High School, and the black smoke was at that level from the diesel burnt on those smudge pots. It would go all the way across that valley. And it was just almost sickening, it was so thick. But it did keep the grapes. Once they figured out that they could do the frost protection, that ended that. There was no more diesel. Everybody and his brother started putting water systems in, but they put them down the middle of the rows and it didn't work very well. It cost them a fortune to try to keep the pipes from getting disked under with the tractors and whatever equipment they had to keep the grass down in between the rows. So the ideal way was they had to put the water system in for the sprinkler system prior to planting the grapes. So everybody started tearing their vines out, putting the water system that's like 1957 on. And it took about a few years to get that done, but once that was done, nobody lost any more crops from the freezing weather. And the water did the trick, and still does. No, back here, it's not done. You can't do it after the fact. Well, in these hills, you cannot put the water in. If you try to, it has to be come up under the grapevines in order to not be able to be torn out by the equipment. So it can't be in the middle of the row. It's got to be prior to planting. Prior to planting any vineyard, if you've got any oak trees anywhere in the United States, you've got oak root fungus that's in the ground from the roots. If you have that and you think you're going to plant grapes, unless you fumigate it below ground level to leave 18 to 24 inches deep, your vines are going to have that, and it will start killing the vines within 2 to 3 years of planting them. And it'll continually, the vines will fight it, they'll keep trying to grow roots. That will keep eating the roots away. Your grapes will never produce what they should produce. They're sick all the time, so you're not going to get the bloom, you're not going to get the grapes on it that you would get. So you're getting a third of the crop. Sooner or later, the vine's going to die. All the vines that we have here have it. The technology for that, to stop that, was definitely here when this grapes were planted up here on this property. And it wasn't used or thought of, and the person that owned it thought he knew what he was doing, but he missed it. So.
But you're trying to remedy that now, right?
Yes, absolutely, we are, but there's no easy remedy. You got to tear it out and replant, which you're going to lose 5 years of planting of grapes harvested in order to correct that. The water's available. Once you develop the water to the vineyard and get that established, you can replant and you can solve all the problems. You'll never have a problem that I know of unless some other bug comes around that we don't know about now. If you can get the water there and get the water lines established in the vineyard to where you can protect it and irrigate it and use frost protection on it, you're never going to lose any grapes ever, to my knowledge, until something else happens. But farming and ranching, there's always another problem out there for you. It's just human nature, or it's the thing of the beast. They're going to get you as a rancher. Or in agricultural, there's always going to be something that is going to hamper you or give you a problem, but we'll solve it all. We'll figure a way around it. And that's what been since time began. The Indians planting corn, they figured it out and it worked. So it's no different. We'll figure it out too. On the ranch, we had apple trees, we had a couple apricot trees, we had two pear trees. I don't know what else, but when the apples started to get ripe, my grandmother, originally when I was a little kid, all she had was a wood stove. In 1957, 8, she got an electric stove and she was in seventh heaven. But before that, she had to get up, and she had a wood stove with a top, it was a Wedgwood. The top of it had like 2 roll-up doors, or they weren't roll-up, but they were open doors. You open and close, and the top of it, she'd make biscuits every morning, but she'd build a wood stove, wood fire in the wood stove, and every morning she'd make biscuits and bacon and gravy or ham and gravy. We raised our own hogs, raised about close to 700-800 head of cattle, and 3 hogs. Always 3 hogs. There were little hogs or there were big hogs, but there was always 3 hogs. We butchered all our own hogs. We raised chickens and turkeys. The grandmother we'd have to pick turkeys and butcher turkeys at Christmas and Thanksgiving and sell them to the local people, and raised chickens. We always had eggs and chickens, and the eggs got sold to the grocery store, and they bought them and what we didn't eat, and milked the cows and took a couple 5-gallon cans of milk a couple times a week to the grocery store, and they'd sell that too. And we raised the hogs, we'd butcher the hogs, we'd cure our own hams and bacons. We had a the first Morton brown sugar cured recipe there was. My grandfather had it, and he would cure the hams and bacons with it. You could walk out, they'd hang it on the porch it was screened in porch that they'd hang that in. After it was cured, they cured it in crock barrels with a liquid. It was a cured sauce, and it was made. It had some funny things in it. It had saltpeter in the whatever. I always questioned that one, but that was part of the curing recipe. It was brown sugar and and salt and that. And the hams took 90 days. The bacons took about 65 days to cure them, but they were all put in liquid and they always put a flat board with a rock on it to hold the meat down. And when they took it out, they hung it on this screen porch, and it would dry out to some extent, but it always was moist. Your grandfather would go out and slice a piece of a ham off the ham and take it with him, and he'd go out and harness up the horses and get on the wagon or the rake or the mower or whatever he was doing but it was originally it was horseback and with horses and teams, and he mowed the fields with it, he raked it with it, and he had a wagon that two guys pitched the hay in it and took it to the barn. And when he got to the barn, he'd pull up along with it. They had a derrick fork on one end, my grandmother on the other end, and she'd back the horse up, and they'd stick the fork in it, and she'd take the horse the other way and walk him, and it'd pull it up to the top and go in the barn, and they'd trip the hay, and she'd back the horse up. Did this a million times a day. But she cooked breakfast, she cooked dinner, and she cooked, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And whenever it was done, she had to go do that too. That was, and she never ever complained one. And my grandmother was the best. She was the best, and she did that with all her children and everything. She was the glue that held everything together. And my grandfather was too, but she just was a darling for everything. But the only time I ever had a problem with her, I was 9 or 10 years old, and I was doing something, and she told me not to, and I laughed at her and took off, and she ran after me, and I squirted her with water, and she took me and spanked the living daylights out of me. But that's the only time I ever gotten any problems with her. We had property it's hard to describe it probably, but in the town of Monticello in Berryessa, the town wasn't very big, but we had property on both sides of Pewter Creek, which it's a big creek. It's bigger than most people think. It was called a creek, but there's rivers that's not as big as what Pewter Creek was. It had run 16 foot deep, and it was at least 300 feet wide in the wintertime. And that's what filled Lake Berryessa. And it filled it in 2 years, when they said it was going to take 16 years when they originally built the dam. So it run a lot of water. But anyway, we would cross that creek to get to and from part of our ranch to the other side of the ranch, and the town was on one side. We lived on the other side. My mom and dad did, and I had a brother and a sister and myself, and I used to, in the summertime, I could walk. It was about a quarter of a mile. I'd walk down the road along their permanent pasture and cross the creek and wade across it. It was like 6 inches deep, and go up the other side, take my shoes off, and walk across to get up the other side and put my shoes back on and go to school. And I'd come back from school every day, and I had a cousin of mine who lived in the town. He decided he was going to stay with me one evening over at the ranch, and we had a 2-story house there. It was 2 rooms, upstairs and a bedroom. And so anyway, he could go stay with me, and so he was a year older than me, and I had talked to my grandfather at one time, and somehow I got the impression from him that if I'd told him about something, we were talking about a skunk, and he said, well, if you can catch a skunk and hold it by the tail, they can't spray, because their body's hanging. Unless they can curl their tail over their back, they cannot spray you. So my cousin and I were walking up this, next to the permanent pasture on this dirt road that went to our house across the Pewter Creek, and this old mother skunk ran out with 5 little skunks behind her. Little tiny guys, they're 3 or 4 inches long. And I said, there we go, let's get him, Tom. So Tom and I run up, and each of us grab one of these little skunks by the tail, and the mother's trying to take the kids and get the heck away from us. So she's running. She's not trying to protect them. So we grab each one by the tail. We got him hung up there, the tail straight. He's not going to spray us. But they did. The tails, they were spinning this way and that way with their tails, but they were spraying. I was spraying him and he was spraying me. We both got sprayed so bad, we couldn't go anywhere but to my mom's. We got there and oh my God, she was so mad at us. She went and she got we had quarts of tomatoes. She got those, mashed them all up, the canned tomatoes out of the garden that she'd canned. She mashed those up. She dumped this tomato sauce all over us that she crushed up. She got in the car and went to town, one store, bought whatever tomato sauce they had and brought it back and poured that on us. Put us in the bath a few times. It was bad. It took days to get it off us. Earl Samuels was one of my grandfather's brothers, and one of his other brothers, which I don't know what his name was, a cousin, I believe, were hunting deer out through these hills, and they're hills like here, but they run. In California, it's not like here. They don't meander around. They're long, straight ridges that run. They're up, they're high, but they run and they're covered with brush, not with trees like here. But the kids went out one day, they were in their teenagers, and they were hunting deer, and they were walking, they went over this ridge into this creek that ran year-round, and they were coming down this ridge and hunting deer, and they come across this water, and it was bubbling out of the ground, and they didn't know what it was. It was a spring. It just popped up, and they tasted it, and it was full of bubbles, and it was soda water, and not like drinking soda water that you buy in the store now, but it was full of soda, real soda, and it sparkling, and it tasted weird, and they didn't know what it was. And to start with, one of them decided, well, only one of us better taste it because it might be poison. They don't know. So one of them tasted it, and it was all right. So they took a little more of it, and so they went home and they started talking about it, and they took their dad back, and they showed him where it was, and they developed it into, and it ended up being called Samuel Springs, and that was my grandfather's relatives that developed this Samuel Springs, and it became a huge thing in the I want to say 30s and 40s, and when, I don't know, California was crazy at that time. It was like the speakeasies and all that was going on. They developed it. They put a hotel up there. They developed this spring. They put a fish pond up there, and this water ran 24 hours a day around it. And I think we took you kids up there. But this little stream that ran by it was full of trout. Little kid, I used to go up there, and we had a preacher come in as a Sunday school teacher, come in there in the 1950s, and we were, whatever you want to call us, I guess, country kids. They're going to make something religious out of us. But anyway, they had a Sunday school teacher teaching us, and he decided, well, he heard about this Samuel Springs, and he said, well, how about if we go over there and camp on the stream someday? So he took about 6 of us over there, and we took our sleeping bags, and we walked in there, and it's a long walk. It took half a day to walk in there. And we camped overnight, and we fished. We took fishing poles with us in this little stream. We took some worms with us, and you could put a little tiny hook on your pole and put a worm on it, and you could dangle it 2 or 3 inches above the water, and these damn fish would jump out of it and grab it. They never hit the water again. They'd go over your back, and you'd take them off the hook, they took them back and we barbecued all that, and you'd eat them, get feathers and all, just crunch them down, fry them crunchy, and we ate them, and it was fun. We slept that night there, right along the stream on our sleeping bags, and had a fire going, and everything was good. And somehow I rolled over and got my sleeping bag in the fire and burnt sleeping bag off my feet, and so I ended up having to sleep with an open sleeping bag the rest of the night. But I'm 82 years old, and I would follow my son anywhere. I'm still pretty dang capable of operating equipment or doing whatever. I've got COPD, whatever that means. I can't do what I used to do, but I still have a lot of fun and gonna enjoy myself as long as I can. I'm not gonna give up. So no, I can do most anything. I can sit my fanny on a piece of equipment and do anything, and there's plenty to do here. So.
Are you glad you're here? I mean, do you like
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. My wife and I, we've bought property here in Damascus, which is only 8 miles away, and we're very happy here, and we're supporting our son, doing anything that he and his lady girlfriend can, anything we can do with him, we'll help him out with it. Yeah. We couldn't be any happier. I would not want to spend my life anyplace else. I spent only been here 3 years, so I spent 70 some years in one county, in Napa, California. I enjoyed every minute of it. Did everything I wanted to do and then some, and I'm doing it here too, and I'm going to keep doing it.
Yeah, thank you for your time.
What else can I say?
I know, thank you.
Mike, drop.
Start crying.
Drop the wrench.
Drop the red.
Hell, I come 40,000 miles over here to see what them pretty little lips gonna do to me, baby. But every single time that I come around, it seems you got another man trying to keep you down, baby. Well, you might think you're driving me insane, but I made the game that you're trying to play. You know, I think you maybe ought to know this ain't my first rodeo. I've been around long enough to know some things you can't take back, some things you just got to let go. Yes. Well, hell, I got Sammy on the phone, Nikki at home, trying to get along so I can deal with you, babe. No, I ain't got time to change your mind, 'cause the bus is a humming. Are you staying, are you coming, babe? Well, you might think you drive me insane. I made the game that you're trying to play. You know, I think that maybe you should know this ain't my first rodeo. I've been around long enough to know there's some things you can't take back, there's some things you just got to let go. Well, I ain't got time to change your mind, 'cause the bus is a humming. Are you staying? Are you coming? Come on, baby. Oh, I ain't got time to change your mind, 'cause the bus is a humming. Are you staying? Are you coming? Well, you might think you're driving me insane, but I made the game that you're trying to play. You know,